Some nice liberty to start my morning. Captain, there's new Illuminate out there, and they ate Jerry! A guy really can't enjoy his mornings these days with the Illuminate barging and creating some new monstrosity. Alright, let's go fight it. That's right, you heard that correctly, folks. There is new Illuminate enemies called the Appropriators, who are giant monstrosities that are quite the challenge to fight, and they've somehow created a giant void in space that eats planets that comes from something called an exostorm. So, we've got a lot to talk about today. But let's talk about arguably the most interesting part of this new lore drop here. First, the Appropriators. These are the three new enemies you'll run into on the battlefield. First, we're going to talk about what each of these Appropriators are and get into a little bit how they work into the very interesting lore of the Illuminate. So you've got three new Appropriators that you're running into on the battlefield. You've got the Gatekeeper, the Obtruder, and the Veraciter. So the first enemy I'm going to talk about here is the weakest of the three Appropriators, the Obtruder. The Obtruder here sure looks a lot like a Watcher, and it appears that it was what once was a Watcher. Because we look at the Obtruder here, it looks like a Watcher, except it's got all sorts of tentacles and weird growths all over it. It looks like this is Watchers that may have been exposed to some kind of dark energy that morphed them and just kind of corrupted them into this evil force. And it also changed how they act, whatever dark energy changed them around. Because Watchers, when they fly around the battlefield, they fly around looking for threats to the Illuminate, and they'll call in warp ships to drop off reinforcements. The Obtruders, however, have lost this ability to call in reinforcements and warp ships. They instead fly around the battlefield in large groups, up to 18 actually, so they can be quite a pain, and they just fly up close and zap you. The Watchers always had the capability to zap you, the Obtruder now only has the capability to zap you. So they'll come up, swarm you, and get real zappy. Now, what's interesting about these Obtruders and the Appropriators as a whole, when the Appropriators on a planet, you're only fighting truly Illuminate forces, which means you do not get voteless or flesh mobs, you're getting only Illuminate. So these Obtruders act kind of like the mass mobs to run around, soak up ammo, and be a distraction, while the much stronger, more skilled enemies like the Overseers and the other new Appropriators we'll talk about in a minute here, are the ones doing the true damage trying to take out the enemies. So these Obtruders essentially just fill the role that the voteless filled before. Now, let's move on and talk about our next enemy from the Appropriators here. We've got the Gatekeeper. The Gatekeeper here, when you look at it, shares a whole lot of similarities with the Harvester. It's got this similar shiny silver metal cladding on it. It's got 3 legs, and it's got a pilot. Now, in the Harvester, it wasn't quite apparent that they had a pilot, but they were in fact piloted by real Illuminate. Here on the Gatekeeper, you can see that this is piloted by Illuminate, right hanging onto the bottom, right in the middle. So, why have the Gatekeeper here when you already have the Harvester? The Gatekeeper appears to just fill a slightly different role than the Harvester. I'm sure the Illuminate realized that the Harvesters were doing great work out in the battlefield and they were very tough enemies for the Helldivers to beat, but they wanted some variety. The one giant laser wasn't quite good enough. So the Gatekeeper here, they must have more recently developed to be a Harvester that is a little bit shorter, so it's not as big of a profile on the horizon, you can't shoot it from as far away, and it has giant cannons for arms. And if we look closer at the Gatekeeper here, we kind of zoom in on its head, not actually its head, it's kind of like the top of the thing and the pilots below it. You'll see very similar horns to the Harvester, and this is because the Gatekeeper does in fact have a shield generator as well. Now, the Harvester puts a shield around the entire Harvester, and it seems like the Gatekeeper doesn't have quite as powerful as a shield generator because the shield it generates is only around the pilot capsule down here on the bottom. Now, what would the reason for this be? I suspect that the shield generators for the Harvesters are quite large and very difficult to make, and they said, you know what, okay, we don't need to protect this whole thing, we just need to protect the pilot, because we've got some heavy armor on the legs here and the sides, like, it can take a hit, we only need the shield around the pilot. So they might have used a much cheaper and easier to make shield generator that can protect a much smaller area of just this little pilot capsule. Now, this does provide an interesting opportunity for the Helldivers. Since the Illuminate have kind of decided to cheap out on the shield here, that leaves the pilot very vulnerable when you actually take it down. So usually one good heavy shot to the shield to knock it out, and then another good heavy shot to this little pilot capsule here, boom, the Gatekeeper's down. A little bit easier to take out than the Harvesters in my opinion, because you've got a very clear target to aim for, whereas personally, I was had a difficult time hitting the Harvesters. Like, I know there's a weak spot on the leg, you just gotta aim for that, but I got bad aim, alright? I had a tough time hitting it. I think this one's slightly easier to take out, but this thing does have cannons, and I want to talk about those cannons. Now, the cannons here are very interesting because they have 2 different attack modes. You've got the charged attack mode, and you've got the more rapid-fire, weaker damage mode. The charged attack mode will do a ton of damage to you and has a wide AoE spread and can take you out from a good fair distance away. Whereas the more rapid fire mode is not quite as dangerous, but it still does quite a bit of damage to you, and you do need to watch out for it. Now, let's talk about the final new Illuminate enemy here that's part of the Appropriators, the Veraciter. The Veraciter here is very interesting, not because it has new fancy weapons or anything, but because it has one mission and one mission only. It wants to run up to you, slap you around until you become 3 or 4 pieces. Because it does not have guns, it literally just has fists and big claws on it, and it will run straight at you. Now, the Veraciter here shares a lot of similarities with the Gatekeeper, and most likely, the Veraciter came first and the Gatekeeper was built off this Veraciter base. Because you look at the Veraciter here, a lot of similarities we see here. 3 legs, couple big arms, it's got a head there, and it's got a piloted capsule underneath that the Illuminate actually sits in and pilots this thing from. Again, much like the Harvesters and Gatekeepers, this piloted capsule has a shield around it to protect it. But this thing, like I said, just has arms and no weapons on it, so more likely than not, this Veraciter came first and the Gatekeeper came after. Which, I don't need to get into too much detail here because we already covered with the Gatekeeper, but if you can take out this shield around the pilot, that makes this Veraciter here much easier to take out, except for one very interesting little feature. Because these Veraciter pilots actually have a very interesting tactic they use to protect themselves while they approach you and try to slap you around. They will cross their arms in front of the pilot to protect it from incoming fire. Now, the Gatekeeper will not, and you can just aim at the capsule and try to take it out. This Veraciter will use those heavily armored arms to protect the very sensitive bit called the pilot piloting the whole thing. This is actually quite a dangerous tactic because you really cannot get through easily. The arms here have very heavy armor on them and you need some heavy weapons to be able to punch through. But the Veracitors have a very interesting little weak point with those arms. If you look at the sides here, they actually have unarmored weak points that if you shoot them, it will like knock off an arm or a leg, and you can actually take these things down much easier that way. So when you're trying to take them down, instead of aiming for the heavy arms that are blocking the pilot and just shooting there forever, aim for the arm bases and you can actually knock an arm off, then exposing the pilot. But, arms and fancy technology aside, these Veracitors tend to act very similar to the Chargers. They'll stay at a distance, and once they see you, they'll start moving towards you, and eventually once they get close enough where they think they can charge in and slap you around, they'll pick up speed, charge, and try to smack you with their massive claws and take you out. So that kind of wraps up talking about the new Appropriator enemies that are in the game. Let's talk about how these new enemies work into the Illuminate lore, because I think there's some very interesting tidbits to pick apart here. Let's start with the first one, the Intruder, because I mentioned a little bit of lore stuff earlier and how these essentially look like corrupted versions of the Watchers. I think this kind of narrows into something that went on here. So I've mentioned in previous videos about the Illuminate here that from the First Galactic War and the Illuminate in that one to the Second Galactic War and the Illuminate we see today, they seem like they've kind of been corrupted by some dark energy. In the first game and the First Galactic War, they were very like clean-cut, science-based society, and it seemed like we caught them off guard and they were responding to us, instead of now in the second game, where the Illuminate seem much more heavily war-focused and trying to get back at us and take us out. Like their technology's changed, their look has changed, they look a lot more like aggressive than they used to. I think the Intruder is just an extension of that, because I think between the First and Second Galactic War, the Illuminate tapped into some kind of dark energy in the universe that corrupted them, but gave them much greater power, and the Intruder is kind of a even more expanded version of this, where the Intruder is so corrupted that it's gone past the point of being more powerful, and it's starting to lose its abilities. All it can do now is run up, shock you, and be covered in all sorts of gross tentacles. And moving on to our Veraciter and Gatekeeper. I'm going to kind of talk about them as one because, like I said, I believe the Gatekeeper is something that was made from the Veracitors that already existed, and there's like, hey, we got to slap some guns on these things to make them better at fighting Helldivers. I think the Veraciter existed first, and the Veraciter actually existed as a backline unit for the Illuminate, and essentially, more or less, it operated as a forklift. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, Nate, what are you talking about here? How is this thing a forklift? It's got giant mean claws on it. This is clearly meant for ripping stuff apart. I don't mean literally a forklift, but the name Veraciter has forklift origins, which also may not make a lot of sense, but a very interesting little tidbit in the wiki is, there is a company called Yale that makes the Veraciter forklift. So, the Veraciter here could be an interesting little kind of homage to forklifts, but I think this does have some real lore in Illuminate here that kind of makes a lot of sense. So, the Veraciter here may have always existed for the Illuminate, and they literally did use this as not just a forklift, but like a piece of construction equipment where they could pick up large beams and put them around to build buildings, or a piece of mining equipment where they could use these giant claws to dig into the earth and get all the raw materials they need to make their crazy technology. And once they start getting more desperate to fight back against Super Earth, they're like, okay, we gotta use every piece of equipment we have, get the forklifts, throw them out there, they can go, like, slap Helldivers around or something. And as soon as they saw that, like, hey, these Verasters we have are going out there are actually doing pretty well against the Helldivers, they decided, okay, how can we make them better? And then they sat down and designed the Gatekeepers. They're like, the Verasters are working well, they've got a shield around the cockpit, and they can do some good damage. Let's actually throw some cannons on this thing and let it actually unleash some firepower on the Helldivers here. So, quick note from Editor Nate here. If you want to get an idea of how obtrusive these Obtruders are, just take a look at the clips going on in the background, because, oh boy, do they swarm you fast, and are they quite the threat. I would personally say they are a much bigger threat than the Voteless, because they are fast, they will show up, and they just swarm you like this, and zap you. Like, if you look here, they took down my walker. That's scary. Well, that's about enough obtruding. Ha! Oh, that was a bad joke. Okay, back to the regular video. So, I think that's enough chatting about the new enemies, because I want to talk about the new void that is in space, because we literally have this giant, weird, oblong void that's in space now. What's going on with that? What did Illuminate doing there? That can't be good, can that? No, that's probably not good. This giant void here is what is considered a Class 3 exostorm, which is a space-time bending itself all around and creating a giant storm that distorts reality. So indeed, that is not good. Now, we don't know a whole ton about these exostorm voids that are showing up yet, but we do know one thing for certain: they are coming from exospires. They're on planets the Illuminates are unearthing from ancient temples or something or another. But since we don't know a lot, I'm going to speculate on where these are coming from, because you may remember a long time ago, the Illuminate were moving the Meridia Singularity using dark energy. And I think this exostorm void may be using a similar sort of dark energy to, instead of creating a wormhole or moving a wormhole, they're creating kind of like a zone of space-time funkiness where space and materials are warped, and, you know, people have a very tough time surviving in space where materials and time are warped, and they kind of turn into big piles of goo and stuff. So I think the Illuminati have decided, you know what, if we can't beat the Helldivers and capture the planets, put them in the space-time funky zone and turn them into goo. And since we don't really know a ton about these weird new space-time voids, we're kind of need to wait and see how they shake out, because they just recently showed up in the galaxy, and I'm almost certain the Illuminati are going to try to use them to come and attack Super Earth and turn us all into giant piles of goo, which I tell you what is not good. I like being not a giant pile of goo. I prefer to have, like, arms and legs and stuff and be not goo. But we're going to need to wait and see how that shakes out. So, I think that's enough talk about the new Illuminate for today. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about these new Appropriators, the weird space-time funky zone that's going on called an exostorm. And if you did enjoy this video, I'd love if you left a like, a comment down below for any thoughts you have about these new Illuminate, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to stay tuned for more. Thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.